epidemiological and statistical modelling groups from 7 universities who have been generating predictions and advice feeding into SPI-M and SAGE over the past year. In this monthly series, leads from each of the groups will be presenting some of the work that they're doing. And before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to ask you, before I introduce today's speaker, I would ask that you please ask any questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and we will take questions at the end of the talk. Also, just to alert you that there is a live transcript button, and that if you press this button, you get a transcript of the talk. So if you're hard of hearing, you might find this useful. So Arnell, if you're there.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you're able to, oh cool, you're doing the recording and live streaming, that's great, thank you. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Matt Keeling, who is leading the JUNIPER consortium along with Professor Julia Gog. So Matt is Professor in the Mathematics Institute and School of Life Sciences at the University of Warwick, where he is also the Director of the Zeeman Institute for Systems Biology and Infectious Disease Epidemiology Research. Matt is a member of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling, SPI-M, and the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, JCVI. And he's going to be speaking today about some work that they've recently published in Lancet Infectious Diseases on models for vaccination in the UK. So I'll pass over to you, Matt, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Cara. Really, really nice to be here. A big shout out to the Isaac Newton Institute for hosting this. It's been a fantastic sort of opportunity to engage with the wider community. This is all work that has been done sort of during the pandemic so far. It's going to be talking about vaccination. It's going to cover a wide range of things. I'd start out by sort of giving a big shout out to the team. So Sam Moore, who really has been instrumental in doing all the work for this, as well as Ed, Mike and Louise, who are also members of SPI-M and have done an awful lot to sort of help push all this forwards. So what I want to talk about is really about predictions for vaccination and how those interact with MPIs, but it's almost going to be a potted history of what's happened in terms of vaccination and vaccination thinking throughout this pandemic and sort of how we've been involved with that. So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to COVID risks. I mean, we've all seen and we're all sort of fully aware of the fact that COVID is a very sort of age-dependent infection. I'll then talk about how we think about modelling the actions of the vaccine. I'll then move on to 3 sort of different areas of work that we've been looking at. Vaccine prioritisation, both in terms of what order should we vaccinate individuals in, but also the complicated trade-off between first and second doses. I'll then do a few sort of simple scenarios really to illustrate the impact of the vaccination scheme. And then I'll finally end up with sort of some more recent work thinking about the interaction of vaccination and changing non-pharmaceutical interventions or MPIs and how these sort of interplay as we think about relaxing the control measures that are currently in place. So where's the risk? So I think that the most important concept that's important with COVID-19 is all about the age structure and how that influences the dynamics. So on the left here, we have the population size of England in millions by different age groups. And not surprisingly, there's a fairly constant level of population size till about 60, and then a decline as we move into the older age groups. In the centre is the recorded number of deaths up until, I think this was the end of February. Obviously this changes through time, but basically the pattern is fairly consistent. Peak number of deaths are in those aged 85, but that's a compromise or an interaction between the risk of death and the actual number of people in each age group. So when we look at the risk per 100,000, we see this huge increase as we move into older and older age groups. So very low risk of mortality in the under 50s, and something that's increasing much, much faster than linear as we move into the older age groups. So risk of death is definitely monotonic. So there's always a huge priority towards prioritizing the oldest individuals. So this is purely in terms of mortality. This quite often gets challenged by, well, what about QALYs? So if we look at QALYs instead of mortality, so QALYs are quality adjusted life years. So the idea here is that, you know, if someone aged 80 dies with the infection, we need to calculate firstly, how many extra years of life have been lost? So we need to think about their life expectancy, and we also need to think of their quality of life. So if we bring in all the data on QALYs, which gives us some indication of the sort of the larger scale impact, then we see more QALY losses in the younger age groups, simply because in these younger age groups, you know, each one death counts for more years of life lost. But even then, when we bring it all together, we're still finding that the QALYs peak in the 90s now, and then very slowly decline into the hundreds, simply because the life expectancy is not that high there. But again, we see this general pattern that the older age groups are always the ones that are most at risk and have the most to lose within this epidemic. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is always going to be talking about trying to prioritize protection towards these oldest age groups. So the other thing to remember throughout of all of this is that vaccines are imperfect. So there's a lot of sort of talk, and I shout at the telly frequently when I keep hearing, oh, as soon as I've had my second dose, I will be completely protected. That's not true. We know that these offer gradual levels of protection. So you get a significant win from your first dose, and then you get an extra top up from your second. And these numbers about how much protection you get have varied throughout the course of the epidemic as we've got more and more data. And also probably depend on a lot of different factors, such as age and vulnerability, but also depend on what you mean by protection. And I'll talk about that in a little moment. But the first thing to remember is that vaccines are imperfect. So when we hear people say, oh, well, by the time we've done, you know, everyone over 50, that'll be 99% of all the people that would die with it, and therefore we've got the deaths down to 1%. Well, that's not true, because it's not complete protection, unfortunately. So we've thought about how vaccines work, and so almost all the work that I've been involved with up till now with vaccines is we assume that the vaccine either protects you or it doesn't, and protection is you don't get infected, you don't have disease, you don't get any symptoms, etc., etc. So it's been a very simple sort of black and white process where the action of the vaccination was either to protect you or not, depending on the efficacy of the vaccine. But as we've started to think more and more about COVID, and as we've started to get more details through, we've realized that vaccination really can have 4 different actions. It can block infection. So we know that there's some strong evidence of this already. So if you do detailed swabbing of people at regular intervals, you can see that the vaccination prevents people even picking up the virus, so you can't catch it, you don't become infected with it. So this is important, not only because if you don't catch it, you can't get disease, but also it probably reduces, well, it certainly reduces spread, because if you don't catch it, you can't spread it to anybody else. When we initially did this, the data was relatively weak on this aspect, so we explored a range of different scenarios. But as we've moved forward, some of the data has become better, and we've now got quite good ideas of the level of infection blocking, probably around about the 60% level, depending on the vaccine and depending on the individual concerned. There's then a disease blocking element, which really is about, so even if an individual becomes infected, they may not actually have as severe symptoms as an unvaccinated individual. What's usually quoted is the vaccine efficacy against disease, which is the relative level of disease in people that are vaccinated compared to those that aren't. So that really combines the infection prevention and the fact that you then are less likely to get disease. So that's the sort of often quoted value, which sort of brings those two together. The third element, which is more complicated, and there's some data that's now being realized from some of the household studies where there's sort of detailed analysis of individuals with and without vaccine in a household and their level of transmission, but the vaccine may also block or reduce the level of onward transmission from those that become infected. So even though you catch the disease, you might be less likely to spread it. Some of the good arguments for this is that there's a higher CT value, so lower viral load in individuals that have been vaccinated, and therefore you're less likely to be shedding as much virus. In some ways, this can be wrapped into the level of infection prevention, because we're only really interested in infection from vaccination in terms of how much it reduces the spread. So in some of the early work, we'll wrap this into infection prevention. And then the final element that we're interested in is severity reduction. So it may be that although people get disease, the vaccine may prevent severe disease, so it may prevent hospitalization or death. And this could be higher than simply the impact of it preventing disease. So there's these 4 different levels that we can move through, each of which has an impact on the amount of disease within the population and gets reduced by vaccination. Each of these 4 measures we'd expect to increase as you go from the first to second dose, and we'd also expect there to be variability with age. And so far there's very, very little data to actually look at that. We can do some of this by looking at the phase 3 trials, which were predominantly in younger people, whereas most of the data that's coming out on vaccination in the real world is predominantly in older individuals. So the other thing to remember in all of this is that risk depends critically on the environment. So it's not just about whether or not an individual's been vaccinated, but it's also about how much infection there is in the population. And when we first started looking at some of this and working on this in sort of early January, we were saying, well, actually, there's 100 times more deaths and hospitalizations than there were back in the summer in August. And so your inherent risk is 100 times larger. So unless your vaccine was 99%, you're not outdoing the risks that have just been caused by the increase in infection. So it's worth remembering that sort of just because you've got this partial shield from vaccination, because it's partial, that can easily be overcome by increases in the level of infection within the general population. So I'm just going to do a very quick sort of potted history of the vaccine, just to sort of almost show what we've been battling against. So as you know, WHO declared a public health emergency last year on the 30th of January. In terms of vaccination, not much happened until about the 9th of January, 9th of November last year, when Pfizer made their first announcement of their phase 3 trial results. At around the same time, we started worrying about the B.1.1.7 variant in the UK. On the 23rd of November, we got an announcement from the Oxford AstraZeneca team about their phase 3 trials. On the 2nd of December, Pfizer was approved in the UK for use. And on the 8th of December, we got the first non-vaccine trial use in the UK, which I'm very pleased to say was in Coventry. And we started to get scientific results being published on some of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So that was then approved on the 30th of December, and the JCVI decided what the phase 1 priority groups were going to be for those over 50, so the age and risk ordering of vaccination. We then had further results published on the Pfizer vaccine, so we were starting to get more details coming through. 3rd of February, we had 1 million individuals vaccinated in the UK, which is an amazing achievement when we consider the rollout speed. So that's in under 2 months. We then started to get data from non-trial based systems. So this is data from Israel, where they've been doing a large number of vaccines with the Pfizer vaccine. The 22nd of February is when the UK relaxation roadmap was actually sort of introduced as a concept, and the details were actually sort of formulated. And then as we move sort of closer towards now, we're now starting to get good quality data from the UK rollout of the vaccine. So what all of this means is that by the time you've taken the latest set of results, run your model and produce some output, someone else has produced new data that tells you that your initial set of assumptions was actually wrong. So all the way through this, we are constantly playing catch up with the latest and the best data that's available. And we're obviously keeping a sort of an open mind to any changes that are forthcoming. So with that said, sort of back in sometime around here, back in the summer of 2020, we were starting to think ahead and starting to think about these JCVI phase 1 priority groups. And so we looked at the question of who to vaccinate first. And at the time, very, very little was known about the vaccine. So we started off by considering 3 different types of vaccine. So this sort of echoes back to this idea of how do the vaccines work, what are the 4 different actions. So we defined 3 different types of vaccine. So type 1 reduced susceptibility to infection. So it did the infection blocking and therefore acted to block some of the transmission. So this is more like the sort of classic vaccination that we're used to thinking of with childhood diseases. It stops you catching it, it stops you spreading it, and it stops you being ill with it. Vaccines of type 2 simply reduce disease. So some people were asymptomatic after vaccination, but it still sort of had some impact there. And then type 3 vaccines only reduced severe illness, but didn't have any impact on transmission. So these would only protect the individuals that were actually vaccinated. So we did this, we assumed a 70% efficacy, which could be age dependent, and we look at a variability to that. And at the time, we assumed a maximum of 70% of any age group would ever get vaccinated. So we sort of looked around at flu and thought, actually, if we can get to 70% vaccine uptake, we'll be doing really, really well. And we're currently at 95, which just shows how good our initial assumptions were. I mean, it's been fantastic that we've seen so much uptake, but it does mean that some of our original analysis was slightly pessimistic. And I'm only going to talk about type 1 vaccines because we do know that they tend to block infection. So we're closer to type 1 than anything else. So we did an exhaustive search of the different orders that we could think of to try and work out what gave the greatest reduction in deaths for each dose of vaccine. So this is running a simulation model forwards. We kept R relatively low to start with. So this was done in the summer. So we thought we were in a situation where R was relatively low. Little did we know what was coming. And then we allowed R to increase to 1.8 and started to distribute the vaccine, assuming around 1 million doses a day, although that doesn't particularly matter for what we were looking at. So what we found is that for type 1 vaccines, we have an outcome here, which is the blue line, which is just random vaccination of the population. We could do something that was purely based on age, which is the orange line, or we could do something that takes into age and comorbidities, which seems to work very well. So that works slightly better than doing just age only. And it turns out that we'd want to prioritize comorbidities straight after sort of 80-year-olds. So what we're seeing here is that there's a very strong win from vaccinating the oldest people first, simply because we know they have such high risks of mortality and illness. So this was done in terms of deaths. We get an almost identical set of results in terms of QALYs. And at the time we were predicting probably a vaccination rate of around 20 million to be able to sort of put the brakes on a second wave, although noting this is only at R equals 1.8, so it was assuming that we'd still maintain some sort of level of control, and this was before anyone had heard the term B117. So our early work was sort of influential in feeding into JCVI and helped sort of underpin the phasing and the priority groupings. One of the things that we were sort of worried about at the time, and it's still a slight concern, I think, is that we know that there's the potential for the vaccine to work differently in different age groups, and therefore we thought about what would happen if the over 85s had lower efficacy than the under 45s. And then we look at the sort of the maximum efficacy, so the efficacy in the young versus the efficacy in the old. That the top hashed area is sort of a non-valid region because we don't want the efficacy in the old to be greater than the efficacy in the young. But what we reassuringly find for all of this is that in all this large purple region, it is still much better to focus on the over 80s and those with comorbidities first than it is to think about any other ordering. So even when the vaccine efficacy in the elderly is very low, 20 to 30%, compared to say 90% in the older age groups, you're still better to vaccinate the oldest first, simply because they are so much more at risk. And we can translate that into a sort of a death term. So how many sort of additional deaths would we expect if we vaccinated within any one of these regions? And again, if we can get reasonable efficacy, even if it's relatively low in the older age groups, we can still get a wide amount of protection. But as I said, all of this was done sort of over the summer. We got a very different picture of what we thought the epidemic was going to look like. We knew we were going to get a slight raise when things were released, and we were thinking sort of maybe an R0 of about 1.8. Actually, we're now in a situation where we know there was a massive wave in the autumn winter. We had the new variant, which has got a 50% extra transmission rate. So we've had a lot of extra complexity come in. We also have a much better understanding of vaccine uptake. So it's in excess of 95% in the over 70s. We're here probably being a little bit pessimistic by saying it's 85% in those between 50 and 70, and 75% in the younger age groups, but we'll see what happens in the younger age groups. We know that efficacy against severe disease is probably quite high, it's probably around 90%, although the amount of blocking of infection is still slightly questionable. I think we're probably sitting somewhere between 50 and 80%, but the data is still ongoing on this. And so we decided to look at this in a more modern context where we can take into account the extra things that we know. We can take into account the rollout plans in the UK, where we're probably going to be doing 4 to 5 million doses a week going forwards. And we can think about relaxing our non-pharmaceutical interventions in a way that roughly corresponds to the UK roadmap. Not perfectly, but it's a rough correspondence. And we can say, given all that we know, what would be the optimal ordering of age groups through time as we start to relax restrictions? And what we find is that we get a very, very similar picture to what we had before. This is the figure on the left minimises deaths, the figure on the right minimises hospital admissions. But certainly for almost all levels of infection prevention, so all blocking of infection, we really want to always focus on the over 80s and then switch to the 70 or 80-year-olds and the over 60s and so on down the line. We start getting some slightly mixed patterns as we get to higher levels of infection prevention and lower age groups, but in general there's a consistent pattern that actually going for the oldest age group first gives us the biggest win in terms of the ordering of vaccination. So sort of to conclude this sort of first section, so our early work thought of very, very simple vaccine characteristics and really just highlighted that, not surprisingly, ordering towards the oldest and the most at risk individuals produces the greatest reduction in deaths and a similar reduction in QALYs. And the JCVI guidelines that look at both phase 1 and phase 2 rollout sort of combine this insight with a much more detailed, in-depth understanding of at-risk groups. So their characterization of extremely clinically vulnerable and individuals at risk is far greater than we could ever want to fit or could fit into a mathematical model. We find that the conclusion is surprisingly robust to an extreme number of changes. We tried a lot of things to break this, including sort of the vaccine not being as effective in older individuals. We've also tried it with mixing patterns from other countries, and we generally get a fairly consistent result that targeting the oldest individuals is always going to be best in terms of reducing the number of deaths. We get a very similar pattern if we put the latest vaccine parameters in, and only for the very highest levels of infection blocking are there some minor changes to the pattern. So the second question in this that we've been dealing with, and I was really hoping that we'd have the medRxiv paper out by now, but we don't, is to think about prioritising first or second dose. So in the UK, we've gone for a system where we're vaccinating, we're giving second doses at 12 weeks. This has huge advantages in terms of how AstraZeneca vaccine works. It gives better efficacy after the second dose. But it also means that we're in a situation where we can provide more people with their first dose much, much earlier in the rollout scheme. And to think about this, I'm going to come back to this idea again of relative risk. This is risk of death. And again, we've got something where risk increases as we look at, in this case, it's different priority groups. So generally it's sort of age, except we've now fitted in those with underlying health concerns, and we've fitted in the extremely clinically vulnerable and healthcare workers and individuals in care homes. So it's an extended version of what we've already looked at. But again, we've got this pattern where the relative risk of mortality increases dramatically as we move up this scale. And so these were our priority group 1, those in care homes. Healthcare workers and the over 80s were priority group 2, etc., etc. And we could do the simple question of, let's suppose we've got a choice of prioritizing to give everyone their first dose as quickly as possible, or prioritizing to give everyone 2 doses as quickly as possible for a given number of doses. So for example, if we had 10 million doses of vaccine, we could give 5 million people 2 doses, or we could give 10 million people 1 dose. And what we find as we apply this and work down the priority order, we can separate out regions where it's best to prioritize first dose compared to regions where it's better to prioritize second dose. In general, the higher the efficacy you get from the first dose, the more you want to prioritize towards that first dose. This isn't too surprising. If your first dose is giving you the majority of the win, then the action of the second dose is minimal, and you'd probably rather give that second dose to someone else who hasn't yet been vaccinated to increase their immunity. The only sort of real peculiarity is this peak here. For very low numbers of doses, we're better to start giving second doses in care homes as quickly as possible. But this is a very naive picture where we're sort of saying we either want to do lots and lots of first doses or lots and lots of second doses. The reality is that we live in a picture where we can do both. And so we can actually say what's the optimal ordering as we move through time or move through numbers of doses, and think about when we should prioritize individuals with first and second dose. It depends again on this relative efficacy of the first dose of vaccine compared to the second. We're probably sitting somewhere around 80 to 85%. So the first vaccine gives you 80 to 85% of the immunity that you would get from two. And we can see a pattern where we move through the JCVI priority groups. So if we're at a low relative efficacy from the first dose, we sort of want to not quite alternate between giving first and second doses, but the second dose, it wants to come in quite soon after the first. Whereas as we move to higher and higher efficacies and we're getting a bigger improvement from our first dose, then we're prepared to wait much longer before we start giving out second doses, and therefore can put in more protection to more individuals in the intervening time. What I ought to say is although this is sort of a nice illustration, it doesn't include a lot of real world impact. So it doesn't include the impact of vaccination on transmission. So we're thinking of this as just protecting those individuals, and the force of infection to them remains constant. And it also doesn't include the necessary and often quite optimally timed delay between the doses. So we know, for example, that the AstraZeneca vaccine works a lot better if you give a 12-week delay between the two doses, and this doesn't have that type of factor in. So it may be that sort of this picture here where you want to give lots of first and second doses to the care homes group is not realistic, because you wouldn't be giving them enough protection from the second dose. So what this shows is that the two-dose schedule sort of opens up this opportunity, or this sort of this question about the separation between the doses. Do you want to try and give as much first dose protection to as many people as possible, or do you want to target as much second doses to achieve the maximum level of protection in those at risk? And what we find, not surprisingly, is that the higher efficacy you get from the first dose relative to the second means that you prioritize more first doses into the general population. And as I said, there's lots of caveats with this, because it doesn't include some of the main impacts that need to be taken into account, such as the delays between the two vaccines. So I want to finally move on to thinking about more dynamic questions. So this is going to be using the age-structured model that we've been developing and fitting to data since April last year. It's something that feeds into the weekly R calculations. So this captures the full dynamics of transmission. It's age structured with 21 age classes. It's spatially structured with 7 different NHS regions of England, and also the 3 devolved nations. It captures the full rollout of vaccination in terms of who's been vaccinated to date, and also has the priority ordering that comes in from the JCVI. It includes the new B117 variant, and it includes changes in non-pharmaceutical interventions over time that mimic the relaxations from the roadmap. So all in all, it's supposed to give a fairly complete picture of what's been happening to date, and therefore we hope it's going to be a reasonable prediction of what's going to happen going forwards in time, although of course there's always uncertainties with anything that involves human behaviour. So our first question with this with this model was, what's the impact, what sort of herd immunity do we get? As we start rolling out effectively first and second doses over time, so this really is looking at sort of early dynamics is phase 1. First dose is the over 80s and then the over 50s, then second doses, and then finally moving on to phase 2. We can see that as we change different levels of infection prevention, we have a noticeable decline in the reproductive ratio. But what this doesn't ever get to is it never gets us to R below 1. So yeah, so we're in a situation where vaccination can clearly have a significant impact on R, but in these simulations is not sufficient to actually drive R below 1. So this is really saying that although the vaccine is doing well to control the disease, it's never actually going to put us into a situation where we can sort of eradicate it without the need for other controls being in place. These numbers do vary slightly as we start putting in some of the more recent understandings of the vaccine in terms of sort of blocking of onward transmission. We then moved on to think about typical dynamics, and I want to start with a fairly simple scenario where this was done in sort of early February, and we were just thinking about what happens if we switch to different levels of non-pharmaceutical interventions over time. So we could either keep going with the intense measures that we'd had during lockdown. We could have sort of strong measures, moderate, mild, or none, and none being obviously complete relaxation, and look at how that changed hospital admissions, which is what's shown in the main figure, hospital occupancy or death. These have all been scaled, so you'll notice that having no interventions just sort of goes off the top of the screen because the outbreak would be so large. So they're all sort of scaled to be a sort of consistent size. And here we see that, if we just got to February and started allowing things to release, we would end up with a very, very large outbreak with even in the mild and moderate cases, and in the non, we would be sort of really in peril. But as we start bringing in more vaccination, so it's been going since December, but as we push things forward and we relaxed, instead of February, we relaxed in March, then our outbreaks will be much smaller, simply because of the action of the vaccination program. So vaccine can have a really profound impact on what we're seeing. So that's March. If we push things forward to April or even to June, then we can really start flattening out these curves simply because of the action of vaccination, and remembering that the vaccine probably takes 2 to 3 weeks to start having a major impact. And so we're always delayed with what we've been seeing relative to the amount of vaccine that's been given out. But even here, if we don't have any non-pharmaceutical interventions in place, if we completely relax things, then we go to a situation where we still see a large major epidemic. So this really shows the benefit of controlling the outbreak by vaccination, allowing us to relax measures of different levels. And obviously, the later we do this, the greater the buildup of population level immunity and the greater suppression that we can have of any future outbreaks. However, in all these situations, we can never completely relax MPIs, which really goes with our observation that vaccination alone isn't sufficient to push R below 1, because we never reach that critical herd immunity threshold. So finally, to move on to some slightly more realistic scenarios, or they were realistic when we started running them in December and into January, but then sort of things change. What we're going to do is we're using our dynamic model, and we're going to think about the interaction between relaxing MPIs and the rollout of vaccination. At the time, we were assuming we'd get to about 2.5 million doses a week. We're now at 4, so things are a bit more optimistic. We've got 95% uptake in the over 80s, 85% in the 50s to 79-year-olds, and 75% in the young age groups. We looked at a range of infection protection. You've already seen that in the figure when we were looking at R. So anything between 0, i.e. it's not having any protective effect, up to 85, which is probably way too optimistic in terms of preventing infection. And we were assuming that the amount of disease and therefore the amount of death we were seeing was prevented, was sort of at 70% efficacy against death and hospitalization from the first dose and 88 from the second, which was in line with the original phase 3 trials. And we thought about 4 different shapes for MPI relaxation, everything from slight small steps to sudden drops to more gradual reductions. So the first sort of thing we did is, what if we completely relaxed everything in April? Well, we end up with having an absolutely enormous outbreak, leading to a large number of deaths, a large number of hospitalizations. Even after 4 months of vaccination, if we stop all controls, we get a disastrous result. So it's fairly clear that early stopping of controls is just not acceptable. Even if we push that much later, so we're pushing it through until December of this year, then we still end up with getting quite large outbreaks unless the protection that we're getting against infection is really high, up at this 85% level. So it's clear from this that the level of protection against infection is going to be critical. We need enough time for the infection to build, for the vaccine immunity to build up. But even so, any abrupt change is always likely to precipitate some form of future outbreak. So we started thinking about more partial relaxation. So this is relaxing to about what we had last summer. So August, September time in terms of control. And what we see is that if this is done too early, i.e. this is February time, really before we've got much build-up of immunity at all, we're always seeing a large-scale outbreak. Whereas if this is pushed later to April, then we can actually get quite a large amount of suppression by the vaccination, even when it doesn't prevent all infections, simply because it's actually suppressing the number of deaths that we'd see. But actually, the most likely scenario, and what sort of corresponds closest to the roadmap, although we're working on models of the roadmap, is to think about sort of gradual relaxation from the spring onwards. This was actually done at the time from February onwards, when we thought that was going to be the relaxation times. And what we see is that the more gradual the relaxation, the more spread out the outbreak is, and the lower the peak. So a 5-month relaxation still gives us a noticeable peak in deaths, even at 85% protection against infection. But as we move to higher and higher, or slower and slower relaxations, we get greater and greater control. So I think the message from all of this is that we need to be cautious. Slower relaxation always works better, and high levels of infection blocking are really needed to be able to control the outbreak. So that's just a summary. I've just realized what the time is, and I have to be pushing on a little bit. So this is just looking at the number of expected deaths from January this year, pushing forwards in time for 3 years, looking at the 3 different release scenarios. A fast, immediate release, a slow release until December, or a very shorter sort of release just until July, and looking at the number of deaths as we scale both the infection prevention levels, but also as we think about different levels of vaccine uptake in the oldest and youngest age groups. So clearly there's lots of complex patterns here, but we get the lowest number of deaths when we've got high uptake, high infection prevention, and a very gradual lift. So, as I said, all this is being constantly rerun, reanalyzed as new data is coming through all the time on vaccination efficacy. So one example, these were our runs done a few weeks ago, well, sort of for the original paper, which we've done sort of January, February time, if we put in the latest data that Sam run last week from the model, then we can actually see that we're much closer to the 95% level of protection. Some of this is because we've now included more information about blocking symptomatic infection in here. So we are in a more optimistic position, but we're probably still existing somewhere between the 60 and 85% lines, although with quite considerable uncertainty, simply due to the fact that there's a large number of unknowns within this system. So just to conclude, this is a rapidly developing field, and anything I'll tell you this week is probably going to get tweaked and modified by next week. More data is becoming online, certainly within different settings. So as we start sort of rolling out to younger age groups, we're starting to bring in information on sort of vaccine efficacy in the sort of over 50s. It's important to remember that vaccination is not a panacea. For a great number of reasons, there's going to be many individuals that remain vulnerable, either due to vaccine failure or due to the fact that there's people that won't or can't have the vaccine. Vaccination of the oldest first and the most vulnerable first seems to generate the greatest number of deaths or QALYs averted. So there's a very strong argument for always vaccinating the oldest individuals first. Also, getting out lots of first doses is usually more beneficial than thinking about second doses, but we have to take into account the fact that some groups, such as care homes, are going to be highly vulnerable, and therefore maybe giving those second doses is going to be beneficial. Finally, I think vaccination's got a key role to play in emerging from all the current restrictions, but the results are going to be critically dependent on how slowly we release MPIs. What vaccine uptake we're likely to get. We've had a huge response from those that have been vaccinated to date. I just hope that continues into the younger age groups, but also on vaccine characteristics, and those still aren't fully determined. Thank you. Oh, finally, acknowledgements. Sorry, I had to put the acknowledgements up. So Sam Moore has been funded through the NIHR MEMVIA project, and I'm a member of the JUNIPER consortium, and those are some web pages with a link to JUNIPER and also a link to some of the work that's going on within Warwick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was really interesting to get that overview of all the work that's been done. So we have quite a few questions that have come through. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but we'll try as many as we can, and I'll try and write down the questions we can't get to. So first of all, there is a question from Nigel Dyer. So we seem not to be making use of data about actions of other vaccines, for example, the degree of which it prevents spread. Why is this? Is it because there is a lot of variation between diseases and their vaccines, so we cannot use data from one as a prior for another?
Ooh, God, that's a good question. I think it's true. I mean, I think we could start thinking about whether there's prior information. I'm just not sure we've got this level of detail on anything else. I mean, people have looked to some extent on flu. I mean, we've been looking at some of the flu data to try and sort of get an early handle. But even then, I think nothing has been studied almost to the extent that we're looking at COVID now. And I think, if anything, COVID's going to give us lessons for other vaccines to start thinking about how we sort of extend it sort of outwards to think about all these different elements.
Next question from David Woolley. What have you done to analyse the impact of different R numbers in different parts of the population?
I'm not quite sure what the question means, because R is sort of a measure over the whole population. If you're thinking about the fact that there may be some sort of parts of the population that have higher transmission, that's built in to some extent in terms of our age structure, although I think it would be very good to start thinking more about sort of ethnic diversity in here. So we know that BAME is a classic at-risk group, and we ought to start I mean, one plan moving forward into the future is to think about how we try and put those in.
Thanks, Matt. So probably the last question now from Jordan Skittrell. So he says, thank you very much for the talk. What happens to the modified R estimates you first presented if seasonal adjustments are added?
Yeah, seasonality is always a good question because it stumps us all. There's not a huge amount of data out there on seasonality at the moment. I mean, what we do know is that transmission was less over last summer. How much of that is due to the restrictions that were in place and how much is due to seasonality is complicated. Our latest work is thinking about putting seasonality into this picture, especially in terms of, would it squash down any rise that might be caused by the relaxation roadmap? Back of the envelope suggests that seasonality could tend to suppress things going into the summer.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. Unfortunately, I think we might be a bit out of time, but I've written down all the questions we didn't quite get to, so hopefully we might be able to come back to them at some point in the future. And thank you very much again, Matt, for talking. I'll give you a virtual round of applause because it's very difficult to actually do a real round of applause. If anyone has got people who couldn't make it today, this talk is being recorded and the links will go up on our Twitter account. It will be on the I&I website once it's finished. And we hope you'll join us for our future seminar series and future workshops. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.